Greetings all and welcome to MythAppropriation episode 2. This is a discussion of mythos systems, materiality, and human culture. My name is Christian Haunton. I am an anthropologist and a university lecturer. My research area is in religion and material culture. This week I want to talk to you about the Necronomicon. What is the Necronomicon, you ask? Well, you probably don't ask that, because if you happen to find a YouTube video about the Necronomicon, you probably had some sense of what it was already. It's a spooky book. It's a book of evil, a book that has secrets in it, a book that could end the world, those sorts of things. And as with these videos, usually I'm not going to go into great detail about the history of it, because it's covered elsewhere on the internet. I'll link to the Wikipedia entry in the notes below. But generally what you need to know, this was a fictional book. It's not real. I hope I'm not breaking anyone's heart when I tell them that. It was an invention of the author H.P. Lovecraft, invented in the early 20th century, probably in the 1920s sometime. It's certainly when it seemed to appear in his writing. And it was something he created to help dress up his work, something that he and a number of other authors of his ilk were doing in order to give their stories a sense of verisimilitude, a notion that these were real stories that they were kind of uncovering. They never presented them as nonfiction, mind you, but to create that sensibility that this is something from the real world. They dressed it up with trappings of unusual sounding cultures and gods, and in this case, books. Now, even within H.P. Lovecraft's own mythology, this book is not particularly well defined, and that's because that wasn't Lovecraft's priority. He wasn't creating a systematic mythology for a story or series of stories. He was creating a mood. He was creating a setting. In fact, that's one of the attractions, and for some people, one of the least desirable things about Lovecraft's writing is that he doesn't particularly focus on plot. He doesn't seem to care in the least about character. What he likes is mood, atmosphere, setting, evoking a feeling in the reader. And so, to elicit this kind of experience in the reader, he used whatever tools were available to him, and that means that the Necronomicon you read about in one story may not exactly match the Necronomicon you read about in another. Sometimes even within a story it's a little inconsistent. It's certainly an ancient book, dating to the 7th century or thereabouts, and it's certainly a dangerous book. That seems to be the consistency in it. Sometimes it is a book that contains secrets that cannot be revealed or they will be damaging to the world. Sometimes it is a book that contains warnings about the sorts of things that are dangerous to the world. Sometimes it contains spells that can help us fight these things that would be dangerous to the world. It's good, it's bad, it's neutral sometimes, and certainly one book could be all of those things, especially if it is a supernatural book, as this supposedly was. Now, the interesting thing about this, and the reason I'm bothering to talk about it in a video, is that it didn't die with the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. The other authors in his circle brought it into their books, as might be expected given the nature of their writing circle. But then, even after they stopped writing, or moved on to other things, the Necronomicon took on a life of its own. And today we can find it in films. It's the title of one film. It appears in a number of others. The Evil Dead series has its own version of the Necronomicon in it. We see video games named Necronomicon, albums and bands named Necronomicon. We see it appear in all sorts of modern literature, comic books, television shows. It was even in an episode of House MD at one point. It perseveres. It survives as a story, as a prop for other people's stories. And that's what I'm interested in, and that's what I hope you're interested in if you're watching this video. Why is that? What is it about the Necronomicon that makes it something enduring, mythologically speaking? Now, you maybe notice I'm starting to tiptoe into the Lovecraft mythos, the Cthulhu mythos as it's sometimes called. And this should come as no surprise. If you look behind me, there's Lovecraft books and there's little Cthulhu idols here and there. Certainly one of the areas of mythos investigation or mythos unpacking that I enjoy the most has to do with Lovecraft. So it's unlikely this will be the last video where I talk about Lovecraftian things. But I wanted to focus on this because I think, other than Cthulhu perhaps as a monster, this is the deepest penetration of Lovecraft's ideas into popular culture. So why does the Necronomicon endure as a cultural element, as a piece of mythos culture? I think it's as simple as saying that it is an old, mysterious book. But I also think that that sentence can be unpacked a great deal, and that each of those elements, something that is old, something that is mysterious, and something that is a book, have contributing elements that lead to a rich and particularly resilient form of mythological thinking. So first of all, let's talk about its age. It is old. It is ancient to modern culture. It is not written in a language you likely speak. In fact, in Lovecraft stories, it was originally in Arabic, then in Greek, then in Latin, then in English, but the English was incomplete and the Greek had been destroyed and so forth, right? It's very hard to access this particular book. It has a long history, but that history is difficult to penetrate. The idea of old things being mythologically more valid is not at all uncommon. It's one of the things we encounter continually throughout the world, not just in established traditions, which are often themselves very old, so we would expect to find that, but in very new religious traditions. So take any religious tradition that's emerged within the last couple hundred years. What you're going to tend to find is that they will look backward in their claims to authority. That is to say, most religious traditions, including the established ones, honestly, they don't say, listen, I've come up with something new I would like you all to try. They say, listen, I've uncovered the truth of something ancient in a more accurate way. So you should follow me because I have better access to these ancient truths. This is true of the world's large religions like Christianity and Islam. Both of them take their cues from existing religions and build on top of that, even though they have founders, clear Jesus in the Christ of Christianity and Muhammad as the prophet of Islam. It can follow up to modern traditions as well, things like Latter-day Saints or even Scientology or other modern religious movements or religious-like movements. They are generally founded on a principle of something ancient, something old. Why is it that we believe that old things are more likely to be true than modern things? It's probably just a quirk of our programming. We can't see the ancient world the way we can see the modern world. So if you make a modern claim within the modern world, you're going to be measured by all the observable phenomena that we're used to. If you make an ancient claim about the ancient world, that's already sort of a hazy, mysterious place in our minds. This veil of history or veil of prehistory covers that, where we're aware of how little we are aware of about the ancient world. It's filled with gaps. It's mostly gaps. And even if we understand a culture exceedingly well, like the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Romans or what have you, there's still a ton of data between the points that we have that just isn't filled in and will never be filled in. So it's a little easier for us to picture that world being filled with things that we don't see today. Take, for example, something like the building of the pyramids, right? Building pyramids is not all that difficult. Building the Eiffel Tower is hundreds, if not thousands of times more complicated as a feat of engineering. But if somebody makes a paranormal claim about the building of the Eiffel Tower, you're much less likely to take that in because there's so much documentation about how it was really done. You can look at photos and plans and journals of the people who did it and get a very good, consistent, measurable, ultimately reproducible sense of how it was done. If those same sorts of paranormal or supernatural or extraterrestrial claims are made about the building of the pyramids, you have a much more limited selection of data points that you can measure it against. You have some old relief carvings, you have some old texts, and you have maybe archaeological reconstructions of how it might have been performed and so forth. And so there's space for you to fill in something old with something supernatural, with something mysterious. And that brings us, conveniently, to the second feature of this book. It's old, but it's also mysterious. And that is something, obviously, you know, that myths tend to have built into them. A thing that's going to get mythological traction is going to have an element of mystery in it. It's because we desire that on a certain level, I suspect. We are all confronted with the fact that the world around us follows a relatively mundane, relatively predictable set of laws, and that even if you want to go explore the world in great depth, you're only going to encounter the same sorts of laws and rules, the same sorts of materials and atoms and physics that you encounter everywhere else. The difference between the peaks of Everest and the plains of the Serengeti are just a matter of how the atoms are arranged, right, in a strictly materialist sort of view. But this promise that there might be something more, that there might be a mystery out there yet to be plumbed, that there might be other realms of being or inner realms of being that you've not yet encountered. It's very appealing, very tantalizing. It holds the promise of making your life considerably broader than you think it is right now. So there's an attraction to that. And this is a text, as any, I suppose, mysterious supernatural text would be, that promises those sorts of things. You'll note that a text like the Necronomicon, it isn't a book of ancient facts, it's a book of ancient mysteries. And in the real world, there are plenty of books of ancient facts written by wonderful scholars of the ancient world, delving into all manner of things, from the most minute to the most grand and sweeping. But it's not that attractive to people to go through and read those, because, presumably, they still kind of just describe the world that we're already living in, the one you've known since you were born. So the idea of a mysterious text holding some secrets you don't know, that's going to give mythology legs, and that's going to give it something that it can hook into the human psyche with. Finally, there's the third factor in this old mysterious book, and that is its bookness. So what makes a book a good material form for mythology? Well, there's some obvious things there. The fact that it can contain information. A book can contain lots of stories and tales and mysteries in a way that other objects can't. Second of all, there's the fact that it is in fact an object, and so a book, unlike a song or unlike a story, a narrative that's passed down verbally from generation to generation, it has a fixed form. A book can be lost and found over generations. If you have a fairy tale, or if you have an oral tradition that you share generation to generation, if that gets lost and everyone dies, it's gone forever. But a book can be buried and can be dug up and can be translated and all these wonderful things. It has a materiality that grounds it in the world, and that's something we're always looking for in mythos systems, and that's something, if I continue to do these videos, you'll hear me say week after week after week. It's why I start these videos talking about the idea of materiality and mythos systems. It's so crucial that myths have a physical anchor in this world, and books are the perfect vessel for that because they're stories inside an object. Also, there's this fact that if you've ever done archival research, or you've worked in conservation or in antiquarian work of any kind, you know that a manuscript is an extremely powerful sort of thing to have in your hand. A manuscript meaning a book that's handwritten. I mean it in that traditional sense of the word, rather than a printed text. All these stories about the Necronomicon, they're all handwritten versions copied over from one language to another. And that's really appealing. Now, admittedly, that's a kind of appeal you might not know unless you physically encounter a text like this. But once you have, that sense that you are holding something unique, something genuinely one of a kind, that an individual long dead put physical time and effort into producing with his or her hands, that's a real kind of thrilling connection to the past. On top of that, there's the fact that virtually anywhere you've grown up, mainstream cultures around you have, to a greater or lesser degree, already internalized this idea of mysterious ancient wisdom being found in books. Now, this is readily evident in the world's largest two religions, the New Testament of Christianity, the Quran, and Islam. These are religions that focus on their books, for which their books are the foundational elements. The books contain all, or essentially all, of the key teachings that are necessary for everything to be built upon. And, of course, the precursor to both of those traditions, Judaism, with the Tanakh, and all of the text that's involved in that in terms of both narrative stories and belief systems and theology and so forth. Even traditions that don't so specifically focus on a book as the beginning, or a set of writings as the beginning, or recitations, as the beginning of the tradition, such as Hinduism, such as Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Sikhism, which is kind of a mix between the two, of a tradition that didn't start with a book, but the book became crucially important. Those other traditions that don't necessarily start with a written text, they develop one very early on, and those texts remain incredibly important to us today. Whether we're talking about the sutras, or whether we're talking about the Analects, or whether we're talking about the Tao Te Ching, or whatever. It doesn't mean that every religion needs a book, by no means do they. It doesn't mean that every book is going to start a religion if it's an ancient book of mysteries. But it does mean that if I want to tell you a story about ancient mysteries, using a book is a great touchstone tool, because you've already seen people around you, or perhaps experienced yourself, this notion of supernatural mysteries existing in ancient texts. Even if you're an atheist or an agnostic or something like that, you know that this culture exists, and that in fact most of the world takes part in it to a greater or lesser extent. So there you are, a mysterious old book that never was, never existed, but has had incredibly long legs, not only as a literary tool of its creator, but of many, many others from his generation and beyond, and even some people who have tried to turn this mythical, this fictional book into something real by publishing versions of it that you can buy today on barnesandnoble.com if you want to. And presumably those books were created with a motive of profit, but it doesn't change the fact that some people have taken them on over the years as something real, as an element of their faith life, as something to build mythological realities around. And that, again, attests to a certain potency to this story. Alright, well, I intentionally kept this video a little bit shorter than the other one was. You are all busy people and have other YouTube videos to watch, no doubt. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully if you stuck with it this long, you enjoyed it and you didn't just slog through something you resented. If this is something you'd like to see more of, then obviously please do like, subscribe, share. Anything you can do to get some more eyeballs on this would be very much appreciated. If you want to know more about the Necronomicon, particularly the history of the text itself, the stories that people have written about it, obviously you can follow the Wikipedia link that I included earlier, but just type Necronomicon into Google and you're going to find all sorts of resources, people eager to share that kind of information. If you want to know more about H.P. Lovecraft, by the way, you should definitely pick up some of his work. That's easy enough. But you should consider also a podcast called the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast. You can find it at hppodcraft.com. And that is an outstanding, non-scholarly, but very well-informed, well-presented, step-by-step, from beginning to end, podcast that follows all of H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, from the beginning to the end of his life. And it's all available for free, although they do have a new podcast, or new version of the podcast, that is a very reasonable pay site. They're not sponsors or anything. They don't know I'm making this video. They don't know me. I don't know them. But it is a stunning resource for people who want to know more about this. Whether you are an old Lovecraft fan, or whether you just want to get a flavor for what sort of stories this guy was writing, and why people have taken him on so much, especially in the late 20th and early 21st century, you would be hard-pressed to find a more accessible and robust starting place than that. So do please check that out if you get the chance. Other than that, please, if you'd like, stick a question into the comments section about this topic, the last topic I dealt with, future topics you'd like me to talk about. I would really enjoy that. I'm happy to make these videos more of a dialogue than they are, at least periodically so. I'd like to save up until I get a few questions and try to address them in a future video. So if you can contribute to that, that'd be great. One way or the other, I'm planning to make a few more of these videos, so perhaps I will see you in a future video. Until then, take care.